The time in New Zealand was very much so life-changing. And there are people over there that I love and think about every day. I'm so grateful that I served in New Zealand and not somewhere else. Everyone over there, you're amazing people. And anyone that's lucky enough to serve there has received a very special blessing. There's kind of like two approaches to food that you kind of get depending on if you were eating with an Islander family or with like a Kiwi, like a white New Zealand family. Kind of the white New Zealand type of food that you would get was a lot of roasted vegetables and roasted meats, everything covered in gravy. It was delicious. Lots of roast potatoes. It's kind of like a sweet potato that they call kumara. They have different types of kumara. Some of it is like a purplish kind of color. Some of it is like the orange. But they like to eat a lot of like squash type vegetables, those types of things. It was very different when compared to what we're used to eating over here in a lot of cases. But that was pretty typical. My favorites were with the Islanders. One, they fed you more food than you could possibly eat ever in one meal. And they would sit you down at a table. And sometimes it was like a full dinner table. Sometimes it was a coffee table. Didn't really matter, but they would have just plates of food on there, and you'd look at it and be like, this is a lot of food. And it was all starches and protein, like for them most. Like they didn't tend to give you, like, you didn't get a bowl of peas from them. You would get like this root vegetable called taro, which is like a potato kind of, but more dense and drier. They typically will boil it or roast it in the oven and then serve it to you with coconut cream, and it's delicious. Takes a little while to get used to at first if you've never had it, but it's really good. And so they'll have like a plate of that, and then they'll have like a homemade mac and cheese or like something like that, and then they'll have usually like a fish or some other type of protein. Sometimes they would have boiled green bananas. I can't remember what it's called right now, but they take these green bananas and they would boil them, and they come out starchy. Instead of like a fruit, they're more like a potato. And then they cover that in coconut cream. What would happen is you'd kind of get halfway through a plate of food, and you'd be like, all right, I'm doing well on the taro. And then they would take the plate away, refill it, and bring it back out and put it in front of you. And you would have no idea how you're going to eat as much food as they wanted you to eat. But for them, that was a big deal. Like the food culture for the Islanders, especially Samoans and Tongans, was you eat as much as you possibly can. And then I learned that if you make a couple of jokes with them about how if you eat any more, you'll explode in their kitchen or something like that, they would kind of laugh it off and let you off the hook. Otherwise, they might get offended. And so that was a really, really fun thing to have happen. The other big thing was with the Maoris. They called it boil up. And they would take different types of, they call them either pork bones or bacon bones, which bacon bones were basically pork ribs, and the pork bones were kind of, I don't know exactly right, but it was a different type of like pork that it almost was more like the meat around the spine or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it came from, but they put it in a pot with just different types of greens and vegetables, and they just boil it for a long time, and then they put in almost like dumplings into it. I can't remember what they called it. And then they just take it out, serve it on a plate to you. Sometimes they would just have just the boil up, or sometimes they'd have, some of the families would have all this other stuff too. They'd have this big boil up, and then they'd have like roast chicken and other vegetables all on the side. And again, you just ate as much as you could. So it was a lot of fun. You gained weight for sure. English is the main language spoken there. The Maori language is spoken pretty much fluently by all the grandparents that are alive. Not spoken at all by any of the parents, and it's spoken and being taught to the children. The language kind of started to die for a while. It wasn't taught as they focused on English, and then they realized that they were losing part of their national culture and made a big focus on teaching children in schools how to speak Maori, and so now it's kind of coming back. Kiwis is kind of like your blanket term for white New Zealanders, and Islanders kind of is a blanket term for any of like the Maori, Samoans, Tongans, anyone from the Polynesian islands, basically. So the Kiwis typically are more similar to Europeans in general. But everyone in New Zealand tends to be very relaxed and very friendly compared to North America and other parts of the world I've been to. One thing that was always interesting, they just kind of were very go with the flow. And you could go by 2 or 3 hours early without ever notifying them, and they'd just let you in. You could be 4 or 5 hours late. They wouldn't be upset. They'd let you in, very different than over here, where if you'd set an appointment with someone and you weren't there on time, if they didn't, if they weren't there, at least if they're waiting for you, then, people get upset. But they very relaxed in that way. Big thing for them is that every time you go to an islander's house, they're going to feed you. That's just part of the culture. If they have a guest in their house, their culture requires that they provide something for you to eat. Within the different cultures, there's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. So like the Maoris, their building or their meeting places is called a marae. And it's a building, if people are familiar with the Polynesian Cultural Center, you see these typically red buildings that they have these kind of pillars that come up the front and then these big beams that come down diagonally off the side. And they're all carved intricately all up the side. And those all have meanings and history of a certain like tribe. And that's kind of a very important place for them. That's where they have their graveyard is usually a part of the marae, and they have a very strong view of what happens to the dead and a lot of respect for them. And before someone can officially go onto a marae, they're supposed to have kind of this official welcome onto it. You'll go and you'll sit with this group of people, and the chief or someone like that of the tribe will get up and will speak and give kind of a quick history of the people. Then there will be kind of speeches on both sides, as like welcoming one group, kind of saying, thank you. And then you'll go through and you will meet all the members of the tribe quickly, especially the older members. And when you meet them, they have what they call a hongi, which is for the, if it's between a man and a woman, they'll just go up and kind of give a light kiss on the cheek. And between men, what they'll do is they'll place hands on shoulders and they'll they'll put their foreheads together and breathe in, and it's signifying of breathing in the breath of life or sharing that breath of life together. And that's kind of a very traditional greeting between Maori men. And then you'll usually go on to the marae, and then they'll have a big meal. And after a meal, if you want to give a speech, you can't just get up and talk. Or if you do, then you have to sing or do a haka, which is a war chant, basically. A lot of people are familiar with like the BYU football teams or the All Black rugby team, who before each game will do a haka. And that was originally used for war. And it was a means of kind of intimidating the opposing tribe that they were going up against and calling out challenges them. And there are different ones that come from different regions. And some of them are still used today. The most interesting one, in my opinion, is called the Tika Tonu Haka, which comes from the Hawke's Bay region. And they do that during funerals when the body is being carried to the grave to enter it into the ground. Then the men that are there will typically perform a haka, often the Tika Tonu. Not always, but often. Sometimes they'll have one that was more specific to that person, but that's usually what is done. And so you can have as few as 1 or 2 guys doing it, to as many as 200 men that are there, all doing the haka as they're being brought to their grave site. And then they have a whole bunch of traditions with the Maoris that go around what they call New Zealand greenstone. I have a ring on that's made out of New Zealand greenstone, which really isn't very traditional, but they have necklaces and they used to make weapons out of it. And they have a lot of religious or spiritual, I guess, rather, maybe a better way to say it, beliefs that go behind it, where they believe that it was a sacred thing. And they would have a priest in their tribe that would bless the greenstone. And then from the time that it was blessed, it can only be given as a gift. And so someone would get it and have the priest bless it, and they would give it to someone, and every shape has a different meaning. When the person that receives the gift, for when they first put it on, they're supposed to wear it for 1 full week without taking it off and before anyone else touches it, because they believe that it helps to kind of attune their spirit to the greenstone. And if they do it before that, then it kind of gets contaminated by other people's spirit. After that, that first week of wearing it properly, then, other people can touch it and can see it, and it's not really a big deal. And so they're kind of really big on things like that. And then they have different types of carvings, wood carvings, and various significances that go along with all that, all kind of tie back to their ancestors and their family history that they have. It's all probably more than I could tell you right now. But that kind of is a lot of, I guess, the really big stuff. The Samoan and Tongan cultures are more similar to each other, I think, than they are to the Maori culture in a lot of ways. Again, very friendly and opening to missionaries. They have a guest in the house, they have to feed them. They have a lot of culture that goes around tattoos that are designed for tribal use and more so for leadership of the tribes than for other groups. So they have a certain tattoo for men, which goes from, I think it's a little bit above their belly button. I think it's kind of around their waist, higher, the true definition of the waist, I guess, the smallest part. And it goes down just from, I guess, just below the chest all the way down to their knees. and when they get it, it has to be done by hand. It's not done with like the tattoo guns that would be used today. It would be done with a bone, and they kind of like they tap it in with ink into the skin, and they do it over the course of a couple weeks.